Hey, did you know that in 1889, the Crown Prince of Austria shot and killed his 17-year-old mistress before turning the gun on himself in a murder-suicide pact? And did you also know that it probably changed the course of history? Hi, welcome back to the channel. This is Inspecting History and I'm Julian Gower. On this channel, we explore wild, bizarre, unusual stories of history. And today I'm going to apologize because my neighbor is hammering and he's been hammering all day and I don't think he's ever going to stop. So we're just going to roll with this. Today I wanted to talk to you about Mayerling. That's the murder-suicide pact between Rudolf, the Crown Prince of Austria, and his 17-year-old mistress, Mary von Vetsera. So Rudolf was the only son and heir of Emperor Franz Joseph and his wife, Elizabeth of Bavaria. Now, like most father-son royals, these two did not get along because Franz Joseph was very strict and tough and conservative, and Rudolf was very liberal and emotional. And Franz Joseph needed a strong heir. He needed a son who was tough, who could follow in his footsteps. So he got the bright idea to institute this regime to toughen up Rudolf. Now that included gunshots in the middle of the night to get him up, walking in the snow in his bare feet, running in the snow, running at all times of the day. He even instituted a very, very strict and harsh tutor. Now this did not go over very well with a very sensitive Rudolf. And finally, his mother, the Empress Elizabeth, put an end to it. But I think by that time, the damage had already been done. Rudolf was emotional and sensitive and intelligent, and he was also very brooding. And as Rudolf grew, Franz Joseph refused to give him any power. Rudolf complained bitterly to his friends that he was so close to power, but that he had none, and that he could see what was going on, but he could not even open his mouth to speak what he was thinking. So what did Rudolf do? He turned to ornithology, wine, and women. Now, ornithology is a study of birds, and Rudolf was apparently very good at it. He was held in very high esteem with his colleagues, and he also wrote quite a few pamphlets, although he had to put them under an assumed name because, you know, the heir to the Austrian-Hungary Empire can't be seen as a bookish nerd. Rudolf loved the company of women and saw no reason to deny himself. He had a string of mistresses, and when he grew tired of one, which was quickly, there was always one right there to take their place. He seems to have been a little bit of a lover boy because at 15 he wrote, "Love is certainly one of the most beautiful things in the life of all living things." He liked the ladies. It's also rumored that he had over 30 illegitimate children. Now, it's common knowledge that he did have quite a few, but I don't think they quite counted up to 30. But it's a possibility because the man was a womanizer. In 1881, he married Stephanie of Belgium, and even though it was an arranged marriage, it seems to have been a very happy one. In 1883, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth. But eventually, Rudolph's philandering caught up with him, and he contracted gonorrhea, or syphilis, and he passed it on to his wife, Stephanie. They went untreated, and she became barren. That meant that there would be no more children. That meant that there would be no heir. The succession laws in Austria-Hungary were that it could not pass through the female line. So even if their daughter Elizabeth had had a son, that succession could never have passed to him because it would have come through the female line. And that was a big deal. And his one job is to produce his heir apparent. And that's not going to happen. Of course, this strained the marriage, and Rudolf put himself straight into party mode. He spent the next few years giving into his whims, partying, wine, women, gambling, you name it, he did it. In the summer of 1888, Rudolf approached one of his former mistresses, a Mitzi Casper, with the murder-suicide pact. Now, she turned him down because she thought it was a joke. That's when he found Mary. Mary von Vetsera was the 17-year-old daughter of an ambassador at court, and it is said that she was completely enthralled with the prince, and he was completely enthralled with her. And their affair was very blatant, and they didn't try to hide it. They didn't care who knew about it. Mary's mother was completely against this relationship. She felt that Mary was ruining herself for a better marriage in the future. It's not known when or how the prince broached the subject with Mary of the murder-suicide plot, but he did find a willing partner in her. I do wonder how he talked her into joining him in death. Did he put the idea in her head that he was going to divorce his barren wife, marry her, and make her his empress? And then did he come back later and say that that was an impossibility and that the only way that they could be together would be in death? Would she have been so keen to follow him if she had known she was his second choice? At any rate, the two traveled to Mayerling in January of 1889, and on the evening of January 29th, they wrote farewell letters. Rudolf to his wife Stephanie: "Dear Stephanie, you are now rid of my presence and annoyance. Be happy in your own way. Take care of the poor wee one. She is all that remains of me. To all of our acquaintances, especially Bombles, Spindler, Latour, Wowo, Gazelle, Leopold, etc., say my last greetings. I go quietly to my death, which alone can save my good name. I embrace you affectionately, your loving Randolph." And Mary wrote one to her mother: "Dear mother, please forgive me for what I've done. I could not resist love. In accordance with him, I want to be buried next to him in the cemetery of Alland. I am happier in death than life. Mary." Sometime in the night, Rudolf shot Mary, then a few hours later, turned the gun on himself. The next morning, the prince's valet tried to get into his room, but it was barred. So he had to go get a guest that was staying at Mayerling. And they broke open the door and they entered the dark room, and they saw Mary laying on the bed, and on the other side, Rudolf was slumped over with blood coming out of his mouth. They immediately suspected that Mary had poisoned the two. And that is the story that was told to the emperor and empress. At noon, the palace issued a statement stating that the prince had died of an aneurysm of the heart. However, later that evening, when the medical commissioners were able to get in and examine the scene, they determined very quickly that it was a murder-suicide pact and that the two willingly did this. The emperor and empress were told, and the official version was changed to what we know today, that this was a lovers' murder-suicide pact. Mary's body was moved very quickly, almost immediately, and it was buried without ceremony. Now, she was moved to a more permanent grave a few years later, but she was also exhumed in 1946 and 1959 and 1993. In order for Rudolf to be buried with the rest of his Habsburg relatives, a papal dispensation had to be obtained. Now, that says that he was mentally unbalanced when he committed these acts, and he was interred in the Capuchin Abbey in Vienna with the rest of his relatives. And that was the end of that. It was very hushed up. It was quickly forgotten about. So, of course, there are conspiracy theories. So I'm going to go over just a few of the conspiracy theories. The first theory is Mary was pregnant with Rudolph's child. He had her have an abortion and she died of that. And he couldn't take the fact that his love had died, or this was the last straw, and he committed suicide. In 1946 and 1959, her body was exhumed and the skull was examined, and there were no bullet holes. A doctor named Gerd Hollard, I think that's how you say his name, Gerd Hollard, was the physician in 1959, and he stated that there was no hole in Mary's skull. He also got a hold of the papal dispensation paperwork, and it stated that there was only one bullet fired out of the gun. So Dr. Hollard surmises that this was an abortion that killed Mary and that Rudolf then shot himself. I mean, it could have happened, you know. Another theory is that Rudolf took Mary to Mayerling in order to end their relationship, and that there was a violent altercation and Rudolf ended up killing Mary and then couldn't handle it and shot himself. The 1993 exhumation is what substantiates this theory, and that is because when her body was exhumed and examined, her skull was crushed on the left side. Now, that could have happened during the many times that her body was moved. Well, we will never know. Theory number 3 is assassination. So Empress Zita, who was married to the very last emperor of Austria, stated that she had firsthand knowledge that Rudolf was killed because he would not go along with a French plot to overthrow his father. Also adding credibility to this is there was a count who was an ambassador at the court who happened to be at Mayerling when the suicide occurred, and he was in the room when the bodies were there. He said emphatically this was not a suicide because he saw a huge hole in the side of Rudolph's head with glass protruding. But my personal favorite theory, and the one that I believe in, is that Rudolf didn't want to die alone. Okay, I think we can all agree that Rudolf was the driving force in this whole thing. He is the one who wanted to commit suicide. He already approached a previous mistress who had turned him down, and then he found Mary, who didn't turn him down. Had she turned him down, I guarantee you he would have found yet another one to go. But what do you think? Leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So Rudolf was the only son and heir, and he had no son and heir. So the succession then went up through Franz Joseph to his brother, and then when his brother passed, it went to Franz Ferdinand. Yep, that Franz Ferdinand who was in Sarajevo in 1914 and was assassinated and started World War I. So did Rudolph's death indirectly lead to World War I? What would have happened had he lived? Would there even have been a war? I think one thing is fairly certain. I don't think Rudolf would have been in Sarajevo in 1914, and I don't believe he would have been assassinated, at least not there. And then I don't think that Austria would have been pressured into declaring war on Sarajevo and then starting World War I. What I do believe is that we were already careening towards war. If it hadn't been the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, it would have been something else. It just would have looked a little bit different. So what do you think? Did his death impact World War I? Let me know in the comments. I would, again, love to hear them. And that is the Mayerling incident. I really hope that you liked this story. If you did, hit the thumbs up and subscribe. And also, don't forget to hit the notification button so you'll know the next time I upload another episode of Inspecting History.